My grandmother and my uncle stole everything from my mom when I was 2 months. I never understood why my mother refused to talk about my grandmother. Whenever I asked about her when I was younger, Mom would either change the subject or give me an answer so short that it felt like she was physically trying to close a door between us. I knew I had a grandmother somewhere, and I knew I had an uncle, but they weren't part of our lives. There were no birthday calls, no Christmas visits, no family photographs hanging around the house, and definitely no stories about family vacations or childhood memories. When I was little, I assumed that was just how some families were. I thought maybe my mother simply didn't get along with them. I didn't realize that when I was 2 months old, those two people had practically destroyed my mother's life and taken almost everything she owned. My earliest memories of my mother are actually pretty ordinary. She worked constantly, kept our apartment spotless even though she was exhausted, and always seemed to be calculating money in her head. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while she counted notes and coins, writing numbers down on an old piece of paper. Sometimes she would look at the total, sigh, and start calculating again. If I asked what she was doing, she'd smile and tell me she was making sure everything was okay. I didn't understand what that meant. To me, Mom was the strongest person in the world. She could fix almost anything. If the electricity went out, she'd find candles. If I needed school shoes, somehow she'd find money. If I got sick, she wouldn't sleep until I felt better. I never imagined that the woman I thought had everything under control had once been left with almost nothing. The truth came out when I was much older, and it started with something incredibly small. I was helping Mom clean the storage room one Saturday afternoon when I found an old box underneath several blankets. It wasn't anything special. The cardboard was damaged, the tape had yellowed, and there was dust all over it. I almost threw it away, but then I noticed my name written on the top in my mother's handwriting. I asked her what was inside. She froze for a second, not the normal kind of pause where someone is trying to remember something. It was the kind of pause where someone suddenly realizes that something they buried years ago has just been dug back up. She told me to leave the box alone. Naturally, that made me more curious. I asked again, and she said it wasn't important. Then she took the box from my hands and carried it into her bedroom. I didn't push her at the time, but something about her reaction stayed with me. Later that night, I heard her crying. I had heard my mother cry before, but this was different. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind of crying where someone is desperately trying not to be heard. I stood outside her bedroom door for several minutes before finally knocking. When she opened the door, her eyes were red. I asked her what was wrong. She told me that she had been thinking about the past. I asked her what was in the box. She stared at me for a long time before finally saying, "Everything they left me with." I didn't know who they were. I asked her and she said, "My mother and your uncle." That was the first time I realized there was a story behind the silence. Mom eventually sat me down and told me something I had never heard before. When I was born, she was only beginning to build her life. She had a stable job, some savings, a small house, a car, jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, and several valuable belongings she'd collected over the years. None of it made her rich, but it meant she had security. She had worked hard for those things. She had plans for me. She wanted to create a stable home and give me the childhood she hadn't had. Then I was born. Mom said those first 2 months were exhausting but happy. She barely slept. She was learning how to be a mother while recovering from childbirth, and she was completely focused on me. My grandmother, according to Mom, suddenly became extremely involved. She started visiting constantly, offering to help with the baby, cooking meals, cleaning the house, and telling Mom that she needed to rest. At first, Mom appreciated it. She was tired, vulnerable, and grateful that someone was offering support. My uncle also started appearing more often. At the time, Mom didn't think anything of it. She trusted her family. She had no reason to believe that the two people who were supposed to protect her were quietly positioning themselves to take advantage of her. One evening, Mom said she was feeling particularly exhausted. I had been crying for hours and she had barely slept. My grandmother came over and insisted that Mom lie down. She told her she would watch me for a while. My uncle was there too. Mom remembered falling asleep on the couch. When she woke up several hours later, something felt wrong. The house was unusually quiet. I was still there, sleeping in my crib, but my grandmother and uncle were gone. Mom initially thought nothing of it. She assumed they'd gone home. Then she noticed that several things were missing. Her laptop was gone. Some jewelry was gone. Important documents were missing. Her bank paperwork wasn't where she kept it. The spare keys to her car were gone. Then she walked into the bedroom and realized that some of her most valuable belongings had disappeared. Mom panicked. She called my grandmother immediately. According to Mom, my grandmother didn't even sound surprised. Instead, she told her that she had moved some things for safekeeping. Mom demanded to know where everything was. My grandmother apparently became defensive and said Mom was too young and irresponsible to understand what she was doing with her money. She told Mom that she and my uncle were only trying to protect the family. That was when Mom realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. They had taken her things intentionally, and they weren't finished. Over the next few days, Mom discovered that money had disappeared from accounts she had trusted her family with. Some belongings had been sold, some had been transferred, some documents had been used to gain access to things Mom didn't even realize could be accessed. The worst part was that Mom had been completely vulnerable. She had a newborn baby, she was sleep-deprived, she was recovering physically and emotionally. And the two people who knew exactly how vulnerable she was had chosen that moment to take advantage of her. Mom said she confronted my uncle. He laughed. That detail bothered me more than almost anything else. He didn't apologize. He didn't act ashamed. He told her that she was being dramatic and that everything would eventually make sense. When Mom demanded her belongings back, he told her she was acting like an ungrateful child. Then my grandmother said something that Mom never forgot. She told her, "You're a mother now, you don't need all these things anymore." Mom said that sentence broke something inside her, because she realized they didn't see her as a person anymore. They saw her as someone they could control. Mom went to the police, but because some of the property had been given voluntarily in the past and because certain financial matters were complicated, getting everything back wasn't simple. Some things couldn't be recovered, some money was already gone, some belongings had been sold. Some documents had been changed, and my grandmother kept insisting that she had done nothing wrong. She even told other relatives that Mom was having some kind of breakdown because of the stress of becoming a new mother. That part made me furious when I heard it. My grandmother wasn't just taking things. She was trying to make everyone believe my mother was the problem. Mom eventually cut them off completely. She changed her locks, she opened new accounts, she replaced documents. She stopped answering calls, she moved, she started rebuilding her life from almost nothing, and she did it while raising me. I asked her why she never told me any of this. She said, "Because I didn't want you growing up hating people because of what they did to me." That answer completely changed the way I saw her for years. I thought Mom avoided talking about my grandmother because she was bitter. Now I understood. She had been protecting me from a family history she didn't want me carrying. I asked whether my grandmother ever apologized. Mom laughed, but there was no humor in it. She told me that years later my grandmother contacted her, not to apologize, not to return anything. She wanted money. Apparently my uncle had gotten into financial trouble and my grandmother believed Mom should help because family takes care of family. Mom refused. That apparently caused another argument. My grandmother accused her of being selfish. Mom told her she had spent years rebuilding the life they had taken from her and wasn't going to hand any of it over again. Then she hung up. I thought that was the end of the story. It wasn't. A few months after Mom told me everything, I started searching through the old box again. She eventually allowed me to open it. Inside were photographs, old bank statements, letters, receipts, and documents from around the time I was born. There was one photograph that stopped me completely. It was a picture of my mother holding me when I was only a few weeks old. She looked exhausted, but she was smiling. Behind her were things I had never seen before. Furniture, decorations, jewelry boxes, family photographs, and belongings that were apparently part of the life she had before everything disappeared. I asked her what happened to all of it. She said, "They took most of it." I looked at the photograph again, then I realized something. The house I grew up in didn't contain any of those things. Not because Mom didn't like them, not because she had thrown them away. They were gone. I suddenly understood why our house had always felt so empty, why Mom never had expensive jewelry, why she drove an old car for years, why she always seemed terrified of unexpected expenses, why she worked so hard, why she kept every receipt, why she never trusted anyone with her finances. She had built our entire life from the ashes of what my grandmother and uncle had done. Then I found a letter. It was written by my grandmother. I expected an apology. Instead, it was basically an explanation. She claimed that my mother had always been irresponsible, that she and my uncle had only taken things because they believed they could manage them better, and that Mom had become ungrateful afterward. There was no remorse, not one sentence saying, "I'm sorry." Not one sentence acknowledging what they had done, just excuses. I read that letter 3 times. Then I asked Mom if she wanted it. She said no. She told me to throw it away. I couldn't. I kept it, not because I wanted revenge, but because it was proof. Proof that Mom hadn't imagined it. Proof that she hadn't exaggerated. Proof that the family story we'd been told wasn't the truth. Years later, my grandmother became sick. Suddenly, relatives started contacting Mom. They told her that she should visit. They said that whatever happened in the past should be forgot. They said my grandmother was old and didn't have much time left. One relative even told Mom that she would regret not forgiving her. Mom listened quietly, then she asked one question. Did she ever apologize? The relative went silent. Mom asked again. Did she ever return what she took? Another silence. Mom said, "Then what exactly am I supposed to forgive?" I remember hearing that conversation and realizing something important. Forgiveness isn't the same thing as pretending nothing happened. Mom eventually decided not to visit. She didn't celebrate my grandmother's illness. She didn't wish her harm. She simply stayed away. That was her choice. My grandmother eventually passed away. My uncle contacted me afterward. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He told me that there were some things my grandmother wanted me to have. I asked what they were. He said, "Family belongings." That phrase immediately made me suspicious. I asked him whether they were the things taken from my mother. He didn't answer. I asked again, still nothing. Finally he said, "Some of them." I told him I didn't want anything. He became angry. He said my mother had poisoned me against the family. I told him that wasn't true. I had read the documents myself. I had seen the photographs. I had read my grandmother's letter. I knew what happened. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "You weren't even old enough to remember it." And I responded, "Exactly, that's why I believe the evidence instead of your version." He hung up. I never spoke to him again. The strangest part is that I don't feel like I lost a grandmother. I never really had one. What I lost was the idea that my family was supposed to be the safest place in the world. But somehow Mom taught me something much more important. Family isn't automatically the people who share your blood. Family is the person who stays up with you when you're sick. The person who works when they're exhausted so you can eat. The person who gives up things so you can have opportunities. The person who protects you even when nobody is protecting them. My mother lost almost everything when I was 2 months old, but she didn't lose herself. She rebuilt, she raised me, she created a life without the people who tried to control her, and eventually she stopped needing them to admit they were wrong. That was probably the greatest victory of all, because my grandmother and uncle thought they were taking things from my mother. Money, jewelry, property, security. But the one thing they could never take was the relationship between my mother and me. They couldn't take the years we spent together. They couldn't take the memories. They couldn't take the sacrifices she made. And they definitely couldn't take the fact that despite everything they did, she still became the kind of mother who taught me not to become bitter. Sometimes I think about that photograph of her holding me when I was only a few weeks old. She was exhausted. She had no idea what was coming. She didn't know that people she trusted were about to betray her. She didn't know that she would have to rebuild almost everything. But she was smiling at me, and now I understand why. Maybe she didn't know how she was going to survive. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she was completely overwhelmed. But she knew one thing: she had me. And apparently that was enough for her to start over. So if there's one thing I learned from my mother's story, it's that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from people who know exactly where you keep your spare keys, exactly where your money is, exactly what you're afraid of, and exactly how vulnerable you are. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't getting revenge. Sometimes it's rebuilding your life so completely that the people who tried to destroy it eventually become nothing more than a chapter you barely remember. My grandmother and uncle thought they were taking everything from my mother when I was 2 months old. They were wrong. They took things. They didn't take her future, they didn't take her strength, and they definitely didn't take me. In the end, my mother built a life they had no control over, and honestly, I think that's the part that would have bothered them the most. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment for more crazy confessions I get from people.